Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davidge, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book and DeKalb County Public Library, welcome to another in our continuing series of virtual author events that we started at the beginning of the pandemic last March. I'd also like to thank the DeKalb Library Foundation, that is the fundraising arm of our library system that pays for all of those wonderful things like our Take the Internet Home and 1,000 Books Before Kindergarten that the tax base doesn't simply cover. They also pay for the Zoom account that we're using to come into your homes this evening. So we would especially like to thank them. I'd also like to note that if you would like to purchase a copy of Good Apple, our featured book this evening, Little Shop of Stories in downtown Decatur is the bookseller for this particular event. I'd like to draw your attention to all independent bookstores, wherever you may be and wherever you may be watching. They have done an amazing job during this pandemic of doing curbside pickup, mailing books to your home, delivering books to your home in some cases. And we would just like to let you know that we truly, truly believe in our independent bookstores here in Decatur and across the nation. We'd also like to draw your attention to Black-owned independent bookstores and Black-owned businesses, for they are also vitally important to us all. So this evening, after our official presentation, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to go ahead and type it into the chat or into the Q&A feature, which you can find either at the top of your screen or at the bottom, depending on your device, and we will go ahead and ask those questions in turn. I'm very, very excited to have our author this evening. She, of course, was born in Memphis, a child of an interfaith marriage, and kind of did the reverse carpetbagging thing and moved to New York. But when she did move to New York to better her career, she did some very, very wonderful things, including writing this memoir, The Good Apple, Tales of a Southern Evangelical in New York. It's very, very funny and it's very forthright. And like so many things in today's world, we have to question our perceptions of who we are and how we see other people. And I always find that humor is a great way to soothe those introductions. Like so many great authors, including Julia Reed, humor and Southern writing go hand in hand. And I found myself, like so many times reading Julia Reed's works, laughing out loud at this particular memoir. It's been called sharp and slyly profound. And at points in time, if you're not laughing, you may be pondering greater things about your own faith journey by reading this memoir. Elizabeth, of course, was the contributing editor for Southern Living, where she wrote the Social Graces column. She was also the former editor of Real Simple and Vogue, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Martha Stewart's Weddings, and Apartment Therapy's The Kitchen. And we are so pleased to bring her here this evening to talk to us about her new memoir. Elizabeth?
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I am so appreciative of these virtual author events. I will say, I hope maybe I'm one of the last. Maybe we are all gonna be hugging and high-fiving and kissing each other really soon in bookstores. That would be great. So I have a cocktail here. I haven't drunk very much of it. Nobody worry. I can still read the book. But cheers to everybody that's here. I'm so grateful. So yes, so as Joe said, I'm a Southerner. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. I was born and raised there. My mother's from Mississippi. My dad was born and raised in Memphis as well. I have lots of friends in Georgia. And so I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you to the DeKalb County Library. Thank you to the Georgia Center for the Book for hosting these kinds of events, especially for authors who really love being able to connect with readers, even if it's through a screen. These are just a lifeline, and it's so nice to be able to connect with readers this way. So yes, like Joe said, this is my book. It's called Good Apple. And you know, the questions that I get most often, I'm going to read a chapter of it to you, but the questions that I tend to get the most often when I'm talking to book clubs or talking to other bookstore events is, number one, do you still, or, you know, how did you kind of come to write this book? Did you always want to write a book? How did you decide on this kind of book? And then number two, do you still live in a 2-bedroom apartment in New York City with all 3 of your children? And the answer to number 2 is yes. I am still currently in a 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. I have 3 children who are 11, 8, and almost 3. The 3-year-old sleeps in a closet. I wrote about that. He still sleeps in that closet. So we are beginning, though, to get serious about maybe looking for a slightly bigger apartment, but I feel like that is one thing that everyone always asks me. So I will answer whatever questions you have about small space living. Just put those in the chat. But yes, we are still in a 2-bedroom apartment. I kicked everyone out so that I could have some quiet to be able to talk to you. And in terms of just the impetus behind writing this book and how I ended up writing this type of book was, to be honest, I am in my 40s. I've been a magazine editor and writer for 22 years, I guess, at this point, ever since I graduated from college. In fact, Joe mentioned that I worked at Vogue early on in my career. I worked in the beauty department. I was a beauty editor. And it was back when Julia Reed actually still did a lot of their sort of celebrity profiles and a lot of political profiles for them. And I love Julia Reed, so I appreciate so much that comparison, more than you know, Joe. But she would occasionally come to the Vogue offices, and we could hear her from several hallways away because she had that great sort of booming laugh and voice, and I could hear her Southern accent. And she would come over to the beauty department looking for products or face creams or lipsticks or whatever it was. And anyway, so I think that the first time I met her, I probably, wet my pants and didn't say anything, but I have really good memories of seeing her in the Vogue offices, and she's always been one of my favorite Southern writers. So, so writing this book, I've always wanted to write a book. I think that most people who take writing on as a career, whether it's magazines or newspapers, have it in the back of their head that they would like to write a book. When I began talking to a friend of mine who's a former magazine editor that I knew, who ended up being my literary agent, she was taking on a new career. And she and I got together and we're talking about sort of book ideas, if I'd ever thought about writing a book, what I would want to write about. And I thought, okay, well, what am I passionate about? I knew nonfiction was really where my talent lay. I knew that I was not going to write a sweeping historical romance novel. So we started talking about things I was passionate about. I was passionate about New York. I was passionate about raising kids in a small space and being a Southerner, having moved to the city. And she really pushed me, I think, to broaden that and talk a little bit more intimately about my faith, about what had changed in terms of certain values that I had growing up and my parents had, and how I had evolved and changed in moving to New York City. And so at first I was really nervous about that. I will be honest. I didn't really want to write about my faith. I did not want to write about politics. I did not want to write about any of those controversial subject matters that they say not to talk about at dinner parties. And I just started. I just wrote a couple of chapters. I wrote a couple of essays, and it just really came easily. And my agent, who did not necessarily come from a similar background than I did, really said, this is it. This is what you should do. And so that's really how the book kind of took shape, as I wanted to follow my life growing up in a Southern, pretty conservative family. My dad was Jewish, actually, and my mother was a Christian, raised my sister and I in the church, but obviously we had sort of this dual faith backgrounds in our own family. So coming from that and moving to New York, and how my politics changed, how my faith grew and matured, and how New York really began to feel like home. So I think of this book very much as a love letter to the city, which it could use right now, because we're all hurting, but so is New York. And so it's really a love letter to a city that I fell in love with, and that is very much my home now. I've been here for 20 something years. It's a love letter to my family. I fell in love with my husband here. He's from New York. So I'm going to read a chapter from the book. It's chapter 4. It's early on. It is the chapter that I think most embarrasses my mother in this book, but it is called Naked Family. It has the word naked right up there at the top. So I hope you enjoy. Here we go. And I will say, I began talking about Michael in this chapter. Michael was my boyfriend at the time. He's now my husband. Okay. Naked Family. In June 2002, Michael and I flew to Memphis for my friend Blair's wedding. At this point, we had been dating for about 2 years, but were not yet engaged. It was the start of a period I'll call engagement insanity warm-up. We were in love, Michael was applying to law school, and things were moving in a forward direction. But many of my friends were getting engaged and married, and I wanted, at the very least, a detailed timeline of his plans. During the following year, engagement insanity warm-up had flared to monstrous engagement dictatorship, a rougher period that did conclude in an engagement in July 2004, but not before I almost ran Michael over in his own car while he tried to reason with me from the middle of the road in front of his first-year law school apartment. Anyway, 2002 was still calm seas. Blair's wedding was black tie, and I bought an amazing and impractical dress at a sample sale a few weeks before. Sample sales in New York were a funny business. Young associate editors and editorial assistants from fashion magazines, of which I was one at the time, would line up outside a nondescript building in Soho or the Garment District to get into a room full of clothes by a designer they could never ever afford at full price. I always thought that the rooms looked like they hosted English language learning classes or judge-ordered DUI safety seminars after the clothing racks had been wheeled out. There would be some flimsy accordion screens on one side, shielding a communal fitting room, where women would have piles of clothes they'd grabbed and were hoarding like fresh water in the rapture. In the end, I would always end up buying things that hardly fit or were only marginally flattering, simply because the brand was unattainable and the sale price was so good. Once I bought some wooden sandals from Kate Spade that were one step above traditional Japanese geita, only with a clear plastic flap to hold your toes down. I couldn't walk in them, but I also couldn't afford anything else, and I wasn't leaving empty-handed. Such was my philosophy at a sample sale, and that's how I ended up with the dress for Blair's wedding. A cocktail-length ivory silk column with a black and white beaded overlay that was so heavy, chainmail would have felt like relief. Holding this dazzling web onto my body were two thin straps made of flexible wire, which were also beaded. I imagined the wires were the diameter of something a surgeon might thread into a blood vessel to break up a clot. When it was time to leave for the wedding, which my parents were also attending, we walked out of their back door and into the garage, where Michael and I ducked into the back seat of the car. I sat down, not particularly forcefully, if I recall, but that motion was still too much for the flimsy, possibly not made for real life outside of an editorial shoot, surgical wires to hold. Both straps popped at my shoulder blades, flying forward and showering tiny black beads all over the floorboards with a clatter of tick, 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 tick. "Everyone out, back in the house," my dad shouted. "Get my sewing kit." My father was the seamstress in our family. He excelled at any task that required deft hand movements. He was good at racquetball, precise chopping or slicing of any food, and mending stuff. When a button fell off our khakis or a hole sprouted in a pocket, my father fixed it. He kept his notions in a repurposed fishing tackle box, spools of thread and spare hooks and eyes organized meticulously. "Find me some 1/4-inch black elastic," he said to my mom as he squinted one eye and poked black thread through the eye of a needle. "And Elizabeth, take that dress off." I'm not a large busted woman. For me, a bra is merely a nipple flattening device. So when it came to formal outfits, where wearing a bra would require purchasing something obscure like flesh-colored gel cups that suctioned onto your boobs or strapless bras that were also backless, I declined. If the dress was tight enough, I went braless. And when my distracted dad asked me to please take the dress off so that he could more easily get to the straps, I yanked it down, revealing my fully nude torso in the middle of our kitchen. No one in my family batted an eye. I sat down on a bar stool in my underwear and followed my dad's orders, snipping off the remnants of wire that were dangling from the bodice and handing him scissors to cut the last thread after he sewed 2 utilitarian straps of black elastic onto my dress. We were not even late to the wedding. That's how good he was. A dear friend's husband once said to me about his wife, as the three of us happened to be getting dressed for an event in a hotel room together, "You can see her naked, I can see her naked, but we can't see her naked at the same time." That's how it was with Michael. Seeing me topless in a room where my dad was also seeing me topless created a rip in the space-time continuum in his brain, and he understandably panicked. We had to coax him out of the laundry room to get back in the car. As I looked over at his blank face on the drive to the church, I realized I should have explained to him earlier in our relationship that I grew up in a naked family. But how are you supposed to remember to discuss something like that when it seems like the most normal thing in the world? When I say naked family, I know you have some weird ideas taking shape. Let me dispel those. My parents weren't nudists. There was no taking of stands or discussion of personal freedoms or anything remotely like that. No one was getting the mail and packing school lunches in the nude. Actually, my mom was and still is an avid velour robe enthusiast before 10 a.m. It's just that there was never any shame or awkwardness about being naked in front of each other in the right context. We were always having conversations while someone was shaving or blow drying hair, and not once did my parents say, "Don't come in, I need to put my pants on first." If I got out of the shower and realized that my favorite bra was in the dryer in the laundry room, I would walk shirtless past my dad on the way to get it. If I came home from the mall with multiple prom dress options, both of my parents sat on the edge of their bed weighing in while I stripped one off, one on. I wasn't going to go in the closet to change. I know families where no one comes down for breakfast unless they're fully dressed for the day, who feel exposed if they don't have their shoes on. Let's just say we were the opposite. And God bless my mother, who never, in my memory, disparaged her own body in front of a mirror in front of me. It helps that she was, or is, gorgeous, and my dad told her, and us, all the time. But she never complained about imperfections or pointed them out while I was sitting on the edge of her bathtub deep in conversation. Bodies were just bodies. Some parts were stretched out or wiggly. It just was what it was. Maybe things would have been different if I'd had a brother. I was by far the most free-spirited of my friends. My best friend Vanessa and I would skinny dip in her pool when her dad and brother had left the house to run errands on a Saturday. We also, years later, skinny dipped in the Gulf of Mexico after dark at a wedding, only to be told by a bartender at the oceanfront restaurant, where approximately 75 people watched us cluelessly walk out of the ocean buck naked, that the hurricane that was brewing offshore pushed sharks into shallow water, and we were lucky we didn't get eaten. But most of my friends would duck into the bathroom to change or squeal when I barged into a dressing room unannounced. When I would strip down in front of a newish friend who wasn't used to me, one of them would have to pipe up and say, "Don't mind Elizabeth, she's from a naked family." I still had insecurities growing up. I'm extremely pale and hated it, and was an early adopter of any self-tanning product that hit the market in the late 1980s. When I began attending school dances in 5th grade and realized that in photographs I looked like an anemic Dickensian urchin next to my friends, I started pasting on self-tanner the night before any school function. This led to one particularly embarrassing photo of me standing up, arms draped around my girlfriend's, legs poking out of some Gap Boys boxers with a button fly that I mistook for girls' shorts, with knees the color of a sun-kissed can. Today, I have a bit of a thing about my upper arms, but that's really it. I attribute much of this attitude to being naked a lot at home. Remember, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were naked and not ashamed. It says right in the Bible, Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. It was when sin entered the world that their nakedness became something to hide. In a perfect world, bodies are bodies, and we get to show them off. I think that means I get to be naked in heaven as much as I want when I'm not wearing a groovy caftan. We don't live in a perfect Garden of Eden world, though. And even worse, for me, is that New York apartments are harder to be naked in than houses in Memphis, Tennessee. Just last week, our building was having work done on some sections of brick that had crumbled, letting in water and creating damage on a few windows on high floors. To get to the windows, workmen rigged up wooden platforms on motorized cables that slowly ascended from the building's inner courtyard. Our building manager sent out an email. The scaffold will be on the living room and bedroom windows. Apartments on the D line will see the rig as it travels up and down. Please remember to keep blinds drawn for privacy. The cheap bamboo Roman shade that covers my living room window is permanently stuck in position, so even if I wanted to lower it, I couldn't. But you'll be pleased to know that the workmen were passing by that window while I was simultaneously walking through my living room naked only once. I consider that a huge victory. There are times, mostly during the summer, when I'm so overheated coming out of the shower and so loath to put on clothes that I will contemplate, if I can, say, open the back door off the kitchen that leads to the garbage area and dump the recycling quickly before any neighbors or building maintenance staff happen to see me. The answer is yes. So far, so good. Whether I put on clothes isn't always up to my own whims. I know that. It's necessary to take other people's comfort into consideration. I managed to consistently have at least a bra and pants on when talking to a babysitter who has just arrived as I'm frantically trying to get out the door. Note, I consider a bra the same thing as a bikini top because it is, and we walk all over public places in bikini tops. I can't debate that point. But I'm cautiously optimistic that my children are converts to this lifestyle. They're still fairly young, and we do have a mixed boy-girl bag, which might muck things up. But no one has ever expressed outrage at anyone else's nudity or told me it's inappropriate to serve breakfast topless. We talk about things. There's been much discussion about why my stomach looks like a lump of pizza dough. Those are my son's words. Pale, slightly puffy, and rippled with velvety wrinkles. We have covered nipples extensively, which if you have ever nursed a baby or pumped in front of your children is completely unavoidable. I tell my children how amazing our bodies are, not because I did anything to make it that way, but because God did. The message I want them to take away is that God made their strong muscles, interesting birthmarks, different eye colors, ability to breathe and blink and burp, all of it. Our bodies are on loan to us, and we are supposed to use them for good, which means we need to care for them and treat them with kindness and respect. And because God made our bodies, it's no work of ours, which for me is a great equalizer. It eliminates all the blame so many people lay on themselves for not having the body they want. It mellows out the pressure to change it. I consider myself a feminist, but I get a little preachy when I hear women talk about my body, my choice, because it's only half true for me. I know this phrase is tied to pro-choice politics, and for my thoughts on that, turn to chapter 8. We won't get there. But if I think about it as a larger cry for protecting your body, for loving it, for respecting it, I'm even more belligerent about my position. It's my choice. Yes, plenty of things are, but it's not my body. It's God's body. He made it. He thinks it is worthy and good and to be delighted in. The same God who spun solar systems and put stars into patterns so children could trace dot-to-dot pictures with the tips of their fingers in the night sky, who made ponies and elephants, peonies, not ponies, peonies and elephants and redwood trees, also made me a body. Here we think we're a used Hyundai with a busted side mirror, currently the car I own, so I say that with love. And it turns out God sees a handcrafted Rolls Royce, every part buffed with the breath of heaven. He says, you are a work of art, even if you don't think so. Some parts may look damaged, your skin or your belly or your heart, but that's by design, and I know what I'm doing, even if it doesn't seem that way. My body was damaged too, for you. Now use yours wisely and don't get caught up in the fat-free SnackWells craze that's coming in the 90s. Carbs are the real problem. This is all good news and bad news. I'm more beautiful and loved than I know, but this body is a loner and I should probably exercise. If only I could do it naked.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was absolutely wonderful.
I haven't read that chapter out loud in a long time. I'd forgotten some parts of that. It's probably a good thing I can't see the audience right now if anybody has left the room or is blushing, but.
What I find so humorous about that, but yet so relatable, is that when you're talking about your mother and being a velour robe woman until 10 a.m., I immediately saw the green velour robe that my mother always wore that had those, embroidered white daisies like up on the giant collar and down on the pocket that she tied with that. For some odd reason, they all came with this huge, belt that you tied.
Yes, it was either that or it was the zip up house dress. So my grandmother had the zip up house dress. My mother liked a robe that tied, but I feel like when I think velour robe, I also think of sort of the classic zip up sort of muumuu.
Yeah, well, and see, my grandmother was a very much Mrs. Roper kind of flowing 1970s muumuu with the ruffle looking collar kind of thing in these bold patterns. And she would always put those house shoes on. There were the slip-ins that no matter where they walked, they would always make that like fake leather flopping sound at the same time. Yeah, it's just immediately went back to seeing that, when you read that. And actually, I went back to seeing that when I read it as well. But I think that's a good question about your writing, because, Julia Reed wrote with a lot of humor, but it was always very observational. When we were talking about, the New Orleans and the swarm season, and, she would talk about, beauty pageants and things like that. It was very observational, but yours are very, very personal. And, what's it like to turn that mirror on yourself and kind of really, you have a story and you're writing it, but then at the same time, you realize that you have to expose part of yourself to get to that point.
So I have always been, surprise, I just read a story all about, hold on, my phone is ringing. I'm so sorry. I'm going to turn that off. My home phone. People don't even have home phones anymore. I feel like, obviously, having just read an entire chapter about being very comfortable naked in front of people, I'm very comfortable being emotionally naked too. It's always been a part of my just personality. I don't get embarrassed very easily. I really like to share. I like to tell stories. I think the reason I felt not just comfortable writing about it, but also felt kind of compelled to write about it was because I feel like those are just things that we don't talk about that much. Things about, I talk about fighting in my marriage or yelling at my children, sort of these things that are also so often kind of hidden, I feel like, in our own homes and within the walls of our house that people aren't talking about that much, but I feel like are important because we're all going through them. So it wasn't difficult for me. I think the hardest part was my husband has a personality kind of like mine. It wasn't difficult for him to have things about our marriage or our family out there. He read everything before it ever went to an editor or anybody, and he approved it. I think it is probably difficult to write about your parents in an intimate way, but I hope, and I think it comes through in that's a perfect chapter to kind of say, is that yes, I'm telling funny stories that probably my mother would not tell at a dinner party or in front of her own friends, but I am also acknowledging and offering, oh my Lord, I'm so sorry, you guys. I don't know why that phone keeps ringing. I'm also acknowledging and giving a lot of just praise and gratitude towards her, and sort of how she raised me, that those funny stories that might be embarrassing were also really meaningful for me, like the way that she was so comfortable in her own skin made me confident in mine. So yeah, it's really, it has not been hard for me to share really intimate stories, but I think that's just me, that's not everybody. But I also think that maybe that's why I'm a writer, is so I could write about them and try to and give these start these conversations with people about sort of taboo subjects that will resonate with them, and it might open up a conversation between them and their family, or them and their friends. So I think that's what writers do sometimes, is we can become kind of the conduit for other people to start having these conversations too.
Awesome. And don't forget, folks, that if you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and either drop those in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we can ask those as well. But I also liked the naked family chapter, because I think it did kind of bring into focus the difference between New York and the South, and living in a very densely populated area. I mean, Atlanta is dense. However, we all kind of seem to have our third of an acre to separate ourselves from other folks. And it's a nice little buffer, but it's something that you don't have living there. And I guess it comes down to, you also have a wonderful chapter on Southern manners. And, so I guess that, is a good way to introduce, your North versus South divide, when we talk about culture and living, and, not only how we view the North, but, to an extent, I do think that Northerners view Southerners in a different way, that we're supposed to be more genteel, that we speak slower, that we're very mannerly, that we open doors. If you watch Sex and the City, that the girl from Valdosta had a scrunchie, or maybe she was from Snellville, or Valdosta, but she had a scrunchie in a bar, and they knew that she wasn't from New York. So what are maybe some anecdotal little things like that you found sort of in your time living in New York?
Well, you're right that there are plenty of cities. I mean, Memphis is a big city and it's dense in that sense, but it's not, you don't live on top of each other the way you live in New York. I mean, we really genuinely, literally live on top of each other. So, so it is different. I think that the things that I miss the most about the South and the, Southern manners, mannerisms, the way people are in the South, the things that I really miss that you don't get in New York, is kind of that chit chat and the small talk. When I go home and I get in line at Holiday Ham to buy a sandwich, even if I don't know the cashier, when I get up to the front, she'll be like, oh, how are you doing today? Oh, I'm great. The blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's just a familiarity and sort of a familial small talk that goes on between people who work in a store and you, or people you pass on the street. And it's, New Yorkers are not rude. I think that's definitely a stereotype that's not true, but they're in a hurry. They're busy and they're in a hurry. They're not going to stop and talk like that. So I think that the thing that I have carried over from my Southern upbringing into New York is that I do chit chat with people. Sometimes it drives my kids crazy, but we're in the elevator with our neighbors all the time. We're on the bus. I mean, you live your life so much more in the open because we're not a car culture. So we're not in the car with our kids. We're getting on the city bus with our kids. So we're navigating people and we're sitting next to people. And very, very often there is maybe an older woman or gentleman sitting next to my kids who wants to talk. And I think that is a really great skill that Southerners are better at, is that ability to talk to a stranger, to engage in some warm, just general conversation and chit chat with someone. And I hope that I pass that on to my kids a little bit. I live in about a 20-story building. We do have a staff, like we have doormen that are downstairs kind of for security, and they take our packages and things like that for us. And so there's always someone in our path that we are talking to, saying good morning to, saying thank you to, saying excuse me to, as we navigate the city and navigate other people. And that is something that I feel is such a great life skill, to be able to just acknowledge, look in someone's eyes, say hello, say good morning, smile at them. I think it annoys my kids sometimes because I'm always kind of pausing to say that extra comment or comment on something or compliment someone or make a joke. And, but I hope that my kids have that. I hope that they have that ability to sort of engage a stranger in a warm and genuine and friendly way, because Southerners are so wonderful at that. And that is something that I miss. And we have the opportunity because we are around people all the time. So I hope that's something my kids take away.
Do you find yourself sometimes, saying to them, "Oh, well, when I was a kid, I did this," or are you making the comparisons? And at the same time, it's like, do they drop a y'all? Have you
They
started?
do. They do drop a y'all. One of my very first sort of columns when I was starting to write the social graces column for Southern Living, the very first one I titled Memphis Manners. And it is still something we talk about in our family, that when my kids go to Memphis, they turn on their Memphis manners. And that means they say ma'am and sir, which is not normal up here. In fact, in New York, it's sort of offensive. People don't want to be called ma'am. It's seen as a little bit aging or derogatory. They don't use that kind of language up here. And so my kids definitely have Memphis manners, that when they are talking to my mother or her friends, they say yes ma'am, no ma'am, yes sir, no sir. So they're pretty good at that. And so they definitely, they see the difference, and they have learned. They do use y'all occasionally. My kids like to, when they go to school, if anybody starts talking about sort of your heritage or where your family might have come from, which of course in New York, that answer could run the gamut from any sort of country. And my kids talk about being Southern like it's from another country. Like, well, we're Southern. My mother's Southern. My grandmother's from Mississippi. And they talk about the food or barbecue or all these different things. And I have to explain to them that that's not another country. It's just the way I grew up. But yes, we have a lot of discussions like that. And they love Memphis and they love going to the South. So I think it's really nice for them. They kind of have the best of both worlds.
Treat you well. And barbecue is a religion down here.
Yeah.
And the whole Memphis barbecue debate can be fighting words.
We could be here all night. We could be here all night.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Ooh, we've got a couple questions in the Q&A from the audience. Actually, we have a nice comment from Shayna, and she said that she really didn't have a question, but she wanted to let you know how much I appreciated your book. And we do have one from Linda, who wants to know, what is the biggest discovery that you made about yourself writing this book?
Oh, wow. That is such a good question, Linda. Oh gosh.
That is, well, we could think about it in like just a couple little filler questions,
okay,
to get you going with. So I really liked also about your book that there seems to be to me, it shows a turn in a generation, because I love the fact that you mentioned like Pat Benatar and REO Speedwagon. And
showing my age, but yes.
Well, I truly believe, though, that those poor children who never ever got to have an entire middle school dance with Air Supply, just one, or Chicago 17 album, that's all it took to make a middle school dance.
Raise your hand if you've been to an Air Supply concert. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, but once again, it just doesn't work. But it does have a sense of timelessness, and then we're turning, it's now a generational thing as well. But when you write about things like that, it automatically puts you in a certain point in time as well. So how do you, I know you say you're very, very open to things, but when you put yourself in a particular point in time, how do you go back to it and approach it? And do you know that, maybe for certain audiences, one, hanging up a phone wasn't just a button, and, that turning the channel maybe required going up and actually physically doing it on a giant box that sat on a floor now.
Right. Well, and when I first moved to New York, my husband and I were actually talking about this just the other night. When we first started dating, he did not have a cell phone. And I was and he lived with his parents. And I was trying to remember, did I call your home and talk to your parents when I needed to talk to you? Like, I was trying to remember the first few months of our dating. And he said, Well, I got a cell phone a couple of months after we started dating. I was like, okay, but I must have called and your parents picked up. And I said, hi, Mr. Passarella, could I speak to Michael? And I can't even fathom that now. I can't fathom calling his parents' home phone and asking to speak to him when we were first starting to date. So yes, I mean, but that's, listen, I mean, that's how much life has changed even just in the past 20 years. I mean, I did not have an iPhone when my first child was born. There's no pictures of her. We have no record of her first year of life because there were no iPhones to take any pictures and videos. So, a lot has changed. I do feel like there's so many things about the book, whether it's talking about my childhood and sort of the early 80s, or the music that I listened to, or even just talking about marriage and somebody who's reading it is not married, or talking about having young kids and somebody reading it might be married but not have any kids, or or I'm talking about issues that I've had as a woman. And I know I have lots of readers who have contacted me who are single men and have enjoyed the book. I feel like that is always a challenge, is relating any part of your life to a broader audience who's not experiencing the same things. And that's where I feel like there are always going to be behaviors, challenges, whatever it is, that are going to resonate. I also feel like that's why kind of the thread of my faith goes through it, in terms of the lens I was looking through to face certain challenges. I think that can resonate with different people. So my hope was also that no matter what time period you're thinking about or what stage of life you're in, that there's something you can take away that feels familiar, or like you were saying, reminded you of your mom. That my stories might remind somebody else of their mom, or stories of my mom might remind them of their grandmother, or whatever it is. So so that was kind of my hope. But to go back to your other question, the question from the audience that was talking about the thing that I learned about myself, there were a few things. I've always, ever since I first moved to New York, I felt like it was home. I mean, it wasn't some place I longed to live as a kid. But once I kind of made the decision I was going to move here from work and I got here, it really just was a very strong, almost a spiritual feeling that this is where I was supposed to be. However, writing this book and sort of retracing the steps of my early relationship with my husband, we really fell in love on the streets of this city, and driving. He had an old beat up Jeep, and we would kind of drive around the perimeter of Manhattan and fight and wail and cry and decide if we were going to be together, and all those things you do when you're 23 years old. But reliving those stories, and also as I was finishing the book was really finished before the pandemic hit. It was finished in that January of 2020, but I was still kind of editing it and finishing it up and polishing everything when we were in the worst part of the lockdown in New York City. And I think going through that, going through those toddler years that were really hard in New York, when you're trying to get kids out the door and you're in a stroller and you're pushing and you're carrying and you're not in your van or whatever you would be in a suburban lifestyle, made me realize I knew I loved New York, but it really cemented that not only do I love the city even when it's really hard, but the fact that I did love it so much even when it was really hard was just a real testament to the fact that I feel called here. I feel rooted here. It feels like my home. And I feel very Southern at the same time. I do. I love where I grew up. I have so many friends in the South. But I think the thing I realized is like, wow, life has been really hard at times in New York. It is really hard right now. And yet I've still never thought about leaving. And I still feel so in love with the energy of the city, the people of the city, and what I feel like I'm called to be here for. And so that is really one thing I've learned. And the other thing was, I will be the first person to say I'm a very average mom. Like, I'm not a super maternal, I'm not a super mom, I don't do everything well, but also in admitting that I don't do things very well, and admitting that I screw up all the time, and really just working through my own failures and my own screw ups as a mom has made me realize that's valuable too. Like, I think I grew in my confidence as a mother, because I think I would have said at the beginning of this process, like, oh, I'm such a bad mom. And we all feel that way sometimes, but admitting you're a bad mom, asking for forgiveness, admitting your mistakes to your kids, I think makes you a good mom. And it gave me more confidence, I think, in who I am as a mother. I'm a different kind of mother than other people. I'm a different mother than my sister is, or than my mom was, but then I'm a good mom for my kids. So.
Excellent. So let me double back real quick, because I wanted to mention Shayna's question kind of cut off when she was giving a compliment. But hey, I've hit enter and like things have sent before I finished my thought. So 2020, still like, lingering. But she says that, she apologizes that she wasn't finished typing. But she said she grew up in evangelical church at the same time period as you did. And now mostly vote Democrat. In the past 4 years have been so disillusioning to her. And your book was so comforting to know that she wasn't alone.
No, thank you.
So,
yeah.
And Anne asks, and I think this is a great segue into that, to talk more about your particular faith journey.
Okay, sure. So yes, I grew up in a church that was called First Evangelical Church in Memphis. It was a huge non-denominational evangelical church. The funny thing is when I first started writing this book, and I've always said, I go to a Presbyterian church. I'm a member of a Presbyterian church now. Nobody says the word evangelical really on the streets of New York, especially given sort of the political ties that word has so much, in our culture now. But I would have said, if anybody had asked me, well, yeah, I'm an evangelical Christian, because I thought it just meant you evangelize. As a Christian, you're supposed to spread the good word. You're supposed to spread the gospel. That's evangelizing. And so evangelical, we're all evangelical. I really didn't fully understand kind of the theological definition behind that. So I really actually, researched and kind of worked through that and talked to a lot of friends about that as I was starting this. Like, what does that really mean for me? Again, I don't use that word in my normal day-to-day life because it is such a politically charged word now. But in terms of my faith journey, I don't think I'm any different. I think that, I go to a relatively theologically kind of conservative Presbyterian church. I think the truths that I was taught as a kid, for the most part, I still believe. I think in this day and age now, a lot of people who grew up in our kind of time period through like the purity culture years and all of those things in the evangelical church, I think a lot of people have been really wounded by certain things in the church, whether it was kind of the shaming of purity culture or the treatment of women in the evangelical church. I think there's been a lot of people who have had a hard time. I was really, really lucky. I had really smart, faithful friends around me who I always seemed to kind of get my sort of measure myself and get my knowledge kind of from these friends. I had a Jewish dad. So for me, I write about this in the book a little bit, but for me, I didn't have the typical sort of Christian household where the father's the spiritual leader and he makes all the decisions. My mom was the spiritual leader because my dad was Jewish. So I grew up with a very different kind of power structure, I guess. And I grew up with a dad who just really showered me with love and self-confidence and all of that. So I think that some of the things that the evangelical church nowadays gets kind of, criticized for, I was really spared. And the truths of it, if you just boil it down to its very essence, that the Bible is true, that you come to faith through a life-changing encounter with Jesus, and that you believe Jesus is God and raised from the dead. Those things are all still true to me. So even though it's not a word that I think has a lot of meaning anymore in my life, I think that the faith that I was brought up with, for the most part, with the exception of some of the stuff about the rapture, which I think was a little misleading when I was growing up, other than that, I think that it's really kind of the same. So, my faith journey, I think that when it comes to politics, my faith is here and my politics is down here somewhere. There are always going to be things on both sides that I agree and disagree with. But I did feel the need to sort of talk about that evolution as well, because I think it's important for a lot of Southerners who grew up in the church just to know, again, like Shana said, that you're not alone. But, my faith has not really changed a ton since growing up.
And how have you been, since you're living in New York and you guys have been on lockdown and so restricted, how are you practicing your faith during lockdown?
That is a great question too. There's a lot of Zoom church, Joe. So our church is open for a very limited number of people. So I think there's like you sign up and there's maybe 50 or 100 people who are allowed in the sanctuary to sort of keep social distancing. I don't know if that will change as more people get vaccinated in the coming months, but that's where we are now. But there's no childcare. And I have 2 kids who could very easily sit at church with me with a mask on and be very happy, but I have one who could not. I have an almost 3-year-old. So we're not going anywhere until there's a nursery for me to drop that toddler off at. So we are home, but it's hard. It's really hard. I mean, as everyone knows, church is about community. We're not meant to do our faith alone. We're meant to do it in community with our neighbors and our brothers and sisters. And so that's our family in a sense in this city. So it is really hard. I miss the people. I miss singing. I sing in my living room by myself. My children are not amused, but my children do Zoom Sunday school. My husband and I very often listen to the sermon late that night, or even sometimes one day during the week, because it's hard to sit and listen to anything when the toddler's climbing all over us. So it's difficult, but I actually just wrote a story for another outlet for a newsletter that's part of Apartment Therapy, that it was all about how families of different faiths have handled faith at home. It's coming out at the end of the month. So I actually just interviewed and talked to a lot of different families of Jewish families, Muslim families, Hindu families, different people. And, we're all doing the same things. We're all home all the time. We're all, spending more time having to have these conversations with our kids. And I will say this, and this is a big theme in the book too, is, my kids have really seen me broken in the past year. They have really seen me struggle, and they've seen me stressed out more than I've ever been. They've seen me sadder. They've seen me have a short temper with them because I am so tired of them. And I'm so tired of being in a small apartment with everybody. And I think that that's even another opportunity for us to lean on our faith, is when we are so broken and when we are so down and everything seems hard. So it has led to some raw and difficult moments with my kids, but also time to kind of share with them why my faith's important, why I don't feel like I'm totally lost, why I don't fall into the depths of despair. I mean, I get a little depressed sometimes, and that's normal. But I do feel like, why we can still have hope as we come on Easter, and we're all talking about sort of hope coming out of darkness. But I think that that's been a really important thing in terms of, families of faith this year, is to show the brokenness, and that leads to some good conversations sometimes.
Yeah, and thank you. I mean, you aren't shy about that in the book too. I think that's one of the things, I noticed in reading it, is that you, and kind of like in the Naked Family chapter, you always come back around to your faith. It's one of those things. It's like, yes, nobody's body's perfect, but that's as God made you. Or something happens, but God put that in your life. God put that person in your path for a reason. Where a lot of writers would have some universal truth, or give you like some great quote from Confucius or something like that. You always cycle back to your faith. It's very centering, and one can tell it's very centering to you as well. Because it seems to, here are these sentences and I'm being funny and humorous, but then all of a sudden just come back, and you seem very centered in your writing when you do that.
That's good. I don't always feel centered, but I'm glad I seem centered. That's okay. That's the beauty of editing, Joe, is that I can feel very chaotic and it still seems very centered on the page. No, but you're right. I mean, in theory, yes, you're right. Of course. I mean, it is, life is hard. Life is hard. New York is hard. Pandemics are hard. Young children are hard. Marriage is hard. A lot is hard. And I do feel like, that is sort of the foundation that keeps me from falling under the waves. And so that is what it is. Yeah.
And I do have to say too, that I really liked you had a very humorous style in the book, but I loved how you would switch it up in chapters, and break it down, like in all the Jewish guys that you loved before, and talking about them, and in 1241, where it's just the Q&A about, yes, you had a washer in your closet at one point that now houses the child in the closet, but where's my dryer? and which I found very, very interesting, by the way, but also you're purging, and purging your children's things while they sleep.
We did a big purge this weekend, actually. So I'm thinking about, if I have to put this apartment on the market, I'm going to have to declutter and get rid of some things. So yeah, I mean, those are just the questions I get all the time. Those are the questions people want to know. I mean, people are very curious. New York is unlike any other big city in the way that we live. You know, I mean, there are plenty of cities that have subway systems. There are plenty of cities where, you know, they're dense and people live in apartment buildings. But I do feel like New York is very unique in the way that we live, and the real estate world of New York, and the way kids bunk up together, and the way kids share rooms, and you know, the certain lingo that people have about apartments. Those are the questions I get all the time. I mean, I get questions constantly, like, oh, how do you get to school? So do they ride a bus? Do they walk? How far is it? How many blocks is it? So I love that chapter. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book. I feel like I'm just going to do this as a Q&A. I'm going to ask all the questions that people always ask me, and I'm going to give the answers, and it's going to be right there, kind of in little chunks that everyone can just go through and figure out what questions they want to know. So yeah, I've had a lot of people who live in New York whose parents live elsewhere, not just the South, but anywhere, California, Oregon, you know, wherever, and have said, oh my gosh, I just want to rip those pages out and just mail it to my mom so that it just answers all of her questions. So that was my goal. I want to be of service to people.
Excellent. Well, if anyone has any other questions, do feel free real quick to type those in the Q&A in the chat for us. Speaking of New York real estate, while we're maybe waiting on those last couple questions to go, you know, if you're going to put that apartment on the market, are you going to stay in the heart of New York? Are you looking at those new little areas? You know,
Never. No, we're not leaving. Well, do you mean like the suburbs, or do you mean like Brooklyn?
Brooklyn, yeah, like
Okay.
you know, like you know, what is it? You know, wherever the F train ends, or something like that.
Sure. Yes. I mean, oh yes, there are beautiful parts of Queens and Brooklyn. Yes, we are not cool enough to live in Brooklyn, Joe. We are too old, and we have too many kids, and we are not cool enough. People who live in Brooklyn are way cooler than I am. You know, I am sometimes open to other parts of the city. My daughter plays on a soccer team that practices downtown. And every time I take her down there, I'm like, oh, this is so cool. Tribeca is so cool. I should live in the Village. We should live in Tribeca. But it's expensive. It's more expensive in downtown. And, you know, the thing about New York is every little neighborhood almost feels like a different city. They have a different vibe. They have a different, they just have a different energy about them. The people seem to have a slightly different way about them. So we live on the Upper West Side. We do like it. My kids have friends. They like their school. I will say, for me, we are looking in our neighborhood. And I will say one reason is just because we like the feel of our neighborhood, and we like our school and our friends, but we are right next to Central Park. And it is, when you have young kids in a city, in an urban environment like this, being across the street or a couple of blocks from a major park is huge. Now, Prospect Park in Brooklyn is amazing and beautiful, but as I said, we are not cool enough to live in Brooklyn. So if we stay in Manhattan, I feel like I really want to be close to Central Park. So that has definitely affected where we look. Now, you know, my dream is to just move it within my building. I'm very attached to my building. If you've read the chapter about the rat in my book, you know how much my doorman and the staff of this building have saved my ass so many times. So I love them. I would like to stay here and grow old, and they can take me out in a casket from this apartment building. So we'll see what happens. I keep thinking maybe an apartment in our building will become available. That would be my dream, but we don't know. We think we'll stay in the same neighborhood, but who knows?
Well, you never know. Like, you know, if I'm going to bring back 80s movies, like War of the Roses with Kathleen Turner, she like left notes in people's doors. Hey, if you're going to sell.
It happens. It happens. It absolutely happens. Yes, that is how it goes. I mean, who wrote once about how in New York, you read the obituaries to find the apartment. I mean, so yeah, it's a very strange and yet wonderful world, the real estate world in New York City, for sure. And if anybody's thinking, the rents are down right now. So if you've ever thought, if you want to come up here and rent an apartment, guys, rents are down at the moment. Now it's strike while the iron is hot. Now's your chance.
Excellent. Well, speaking about striking while irons are hot, Allie has put, of course, in the link to order a copy of Good Apple from Little Shop of Stories here in Decatur. Don't forget, they do mail to home. They also do pop-up. You can pick it up at the store itself in downtown Decatur. We also encourage you to find this in independent bookstores wherever you may be, New York, Memphis, Tennessee, elsewhere. But do support your local independent bookstores.
And I have these beautiful book plates that I would love to sign and send to the bookstore indicator. If anybody wants to order from them, I can, get you a signed book plate so that you'll have a signed copy too. I love sending those to independent bookstores who have been so wonderful to me. Please, yes, shop your independent bookstores. They're awesome.
Excellent. We will make sure that we put you in contact with Little Shop of Stories. That way, if people order it,
yep,
the signed book plates.
Signed copy, yes.
Well, listen, thank you so very much for talking to us this evening. It has been a wonderful event that really has highlighted both your humor, your talent, and of course your faith. And I think that even if folks aren't people of faith, in these times, it's always nice to have a touchstone and a bit of comfort, and a nice book to just reminisce about and think about our mother's green robes, or those other times when you went to an Air Supply concert, because it does put you in a wonderful mindset, and it gives us all a little bit of comfort. So thank you so very much for joining us, Elizabeth, and thank you all for joining us here this evening.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good evening. We will see you all very, very soon.